How did they try to humiliate an athlete on live TV? But his silence brought the whole country to its knees. Subscribe and like this video before we get into the story. That evening, the whole country was sitting in front of their TV screens, expecting to watch a routine sports debate on a huge, brightly lit television channel in the heart of New York. The cameras were rolling, the producers were whispering warnings through their headphones, and the host was delivering his routine opening lines. But no one knew that on that night, one of America's deepest wounds would bleed, and at the center of that wound, an NBA star would stand tall despite everything. The woman sitting across from him, Caroline Leavitt, was a sharp-tongued political consultant known for her bold statements on TV. In fact, the producers had already planned a simple agenda for the evening. They would discuss and debate the role of social justice in the NBA, the pressure on young athletes, and the educational aspects of professional sports with Jimmy Butler. But neither a debate nor a sensation was expected. When the big man Jimmy entered the studio, he was calm and quiet. The single button on his black jacket was buttoned, and his face bore the deep weariness of the years. Yet it also carried a clear expression of self-assurance. His fans, who had been following him for years, knew well how he fought on the court. But what he would show in front of the cameras that evening was neither a dunk nor a three-pointer. This time, what he would share would come straight from his heart. When the conversation began, everything seemed normal. Jimmy started talking about the pressure young athletes face to make it into the NBA, the challenges talented young people face in protecting their identities in the age of social media, and of course, his own past. "I didn't grow up with basketball," he began. "I mostly watched it on TV. In fact, I didn't even have a proper place to play. Sometimes I'd fall asleep in the car with my mom," Jimmy said, his voice calm but sincere. There was a few seconds of silence in the studio. Caroline shook her head first, then adjusted her glasses and took her turn to speak with her sharp tongue, which was her nickname. "So you became an NBA star while you were homeless," she said with a dismissive smile. Jimmy smiled at her without paying any attention, nodding his head politely in agreement. "Yes, I guess you could say that." Suddenly, something unexpected happened. Caroline leaned forward slightly, pointed her finger, and turned back to the cameras, finishing her sentence in a mocking tone. "Sit down, kid. This is a leadership platform. It's not just a sport, as you might think." The studio suddenly turned into a freezer, and everyone there froze. Time seemed to stand still for a moment. The studio host stood there with his mouth open. One of the viewers nearly spilled his coffee. So shocked was he that he couldn't even hold his cup for a moment. And Twitter had already started to buzz with reactions as expected. But all eyes were on one person, that giant man, Jimmy Butler. Many expected him to react angrily, perhaps even storming out of the studio in a fit of rage. But Jimmy didn't shout, nor did he change his expression. He simply raised his head and looked into his eyes. And Jimmy's gaze did not reflect anger or arrogance, but there was something hidden beneath it, the weight of someone who had survived, the silence carried by years of being unseen, misunderstood, and yet still endlessly patient. Then he stood up with heavy movements. The cameras were now focused on him, waiting. The look of superiority in Caroline Leavitt's narrowed eyes seemed to be slowly fading. Jimmy's face was sharp and determined, like that of a giant basketball player entering the game. But this time, he was not playing for a basket on the court, but directly for the human heart. Jimmy finally took the microphone. Everyone in the studio leaned forward slightly, as if straining to hear. His voice was neither harsh nor angry, but each word fell like a heavy concrete block, one by one, into people's hearts. "When I was a little boy, I learned to be a mature man. I had no toys. The streets were my school, and my shoes were always torn. But don't ever call me a child, because even when I was very young, I witnessed many long nights that made my mother cry." An elderly black woman in the studio took out a handkerchief and brought it to her eyes. "My mother, Lydia, would always try to prepare a lunchbox for me by watching fast food leftovers. Sometimes she wouldn't even eat, so that I wouldn't go hungry. I will never forget that. One day she sold her shoes and bought me a pair of basketball shoes, but she never told me to sit down. On the contrary, she always said, 'Get up, Jimmy. Please get up.' Because one day no one will lift you up. Get up. Because only if you walk yourself will there be a path. The cameras turned back to Caroline. Her smile was gone. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, like a machine gun, because she no longer knew what to say or how to express herself. Jimmy took another step forward, his voice now even lower. But even that low voice rang in the ears of everyone in the room, like a ringing. When you call me a child, you're not just insulting me, you're also insulting my mother. Not to mention the child who grew up on the streets, waking up hungry every morning, but still hoping for a better life. In the studio, throats began to tighten. Some people clasped their hands together, hypnotized, not moving at all. You see me as just a basketball player. Am I wrong to think that way? Given the points I score, the money I earn, and even the shots I make. But I am a man who has fought for survival behind those numbers. Just as I fight with pride and determination on the court, I have always fought like that in real life. Even the host no longer felt the need to look at the camera. He just bowed his head and listened to what was being said. Then Jimmy suddenly fell silent. He stood there for a few seconds. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He took out an old, worn piece of paper that was folded up in his pocket. This paper in my hand is a letter from my high school coach. It's from 2006. Back then, no one believed in me, but he believed in me and wrote this. Jimmy unfolded the paper and read, "This world will never understand you, but keep changing the world you're in. Don't pay any attention to those who belittle you, because some children grow up not just by kicking a ball, but by kicking their hopes." The silence in the studio had become unbearable. Some viewers were now openly crying, unable to hide their emotions. Others simply closed their eyes and tried to absorb those words. And Jimmy continued, "I was that child, the one no one believed in, always at the bottom of the list, but carrying a mountain of hope in his heart. Ms. Leavitt, you told me to sit down, kid, but I'm standing up because my mother is still watching me. My coach still believes in me. And outside, hundreds of children watching this broadcast in this country may feel crushed by those words." At that moment, dozens of applause sounds were heard from the studio, then another. Soon the entire hall stood up to applaud, and even whistles of excitement began to sound. This was not a sympathetic applause. These were applause sounds of respect. Caroline was sitting in her chair, frozen in place. As she averted her eyes from Jimmy, her face turned as red as a ripe apple. This was actually the plan she had wanted, to humiliate Jimmy and reduce him to just a basketball player, thereby devaluing his words. Of course, she had never succeeded in doing so, because Jimmy's unexpected mature silence resonated more than her outburst. Meanwhile, the studio was still standing. The applause had slowly died down, but the respect for that giant man in the air seemed to have taken root in everyone's hearts. As Jimmy returned to his seat with heavy steps, a figure quietly rose from the edge of the stage. That figure was a former U.S. Army officer. He was not wearing his uniform, but the weight of the years rested heavily on his shoulders. His name was Colonel Jacob Whitmore. His hair was completely white, his voice a little emotional, but his gaze was still steady. He was the first to break the silence. Turning to Caroline, he said, "You called him kid, but I've seen kids like that in the places I've served, and believe me, many of them had much more courage than ours." The colonel then turned to Jimmy, placed his hand on his heart, and walked slowly onto the stage to stand in front of Jimmy. "Mr. Butler," he said, "you represent not only your nation, but humanity here. The resolve you have shown tonight cannot be expressed in words." He extended his hand to Jimmy. Jimmy nodded in greeting, and then shook his hand firmly. The applause rose once more, but this time it was quieter, more meaningful. It was like the final shovel of dirt at a funeral, a silence that signaled the end of something, but also the beginning of something new. Caroline's face was bright red. Her lips were pressed together, and her hands seemed to be pinching themselves under the table. At that moment, she felt compelled to do something. "Oh, come on," she said suddenly, her voice slightly fearful and fragile. "Are we really going to declare Jimmy a hero now? Isn't that a bit too sentimental?" A chill ran through the room, causing tension to rise. A few people rolled their eyes. while others held their heads in their hands. Even the studio host didn't know what to say. There was panic in Caroline's voice now. The only thing she had was slipping away from her control. But Jimmy managed to stay calm. This time, someone else spoke instead of him. A young black woman sitting among the audience stood up. Her eyes were filled with tears, her voice trembling but determined. "This isn't sentimentality, Caroline. This is reality. You tried to belittle his childhood, but he showed us not what he is, but who he is." As the woman's voice grew louder, the microphones picked up her words clearly. "To you, Jimmy may be a statistic, but to us, someone like him is the only real hope in life. So no, this isn't a show. This is humanity." The room was silent. Caroline looked away. Jimmy looked at the young woman and slowly bowed his head. At that moment, something indescribable had formed between them. The recognition of pain, a silent thank you, a shared past that had left the same traces in different places. Jimmy then began to speak again. "I didn't come on this stage today to be a hero. I just came to tell the story of what I really experienced." He reached into his jacket pocket again and pulled out another note. It was a piece of paper with yellowed, curled edges. "My old coach gave this to me when I was in my senior year of high school. I carried it in my pocket for years. Whenever I was in trouble and wanted to give up, I always read this note." Jimmy unfolded the paper, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes were now filled with tears, but his voice remained clear. "Dear Jimmy, your greatest strength lies in a part of you that no one else can see. Never give up, son, because one day, you will not be just another number. You will be someone who touches people's hearts, someone who deserves respect, someone who is worthy of respect." The cameras turned back to Caroline. That piece of paper spoke volumes. Caroline had always thought of Jimmy's life as a show, but now the weight of real life was bearing down on her shoulders. Jimmy turned back to the audience. "You told me to sit down, but every time you thought I was broken, I stood up, because somewhere, a child might be watching me. Somewhere, someone else might be listening to this broadcast to feel less alone, and I can never let their hope fall to the ground." A man couldn't hold back his tears. A young girl covered her mouth with her hand. Her breathing changed. This was no longer a television program. It had become a social mirror for the country. And then, a studio crew member, the cameraman, took off his headphones, put down his camera, and walked toward Jimmy. Without saying a word, he reached out his hand and whispered in a voice loud enough for the microphones to pick up, "Thank you for reminding us what honor is." That moment froze time. Caroline tried to speak, but no one was looking at her anymore. The stage was hers, but now everyone was hearing their own lives in Jimmy's silence. The host glanced at Caroline. Perhaps he was expecting an apology, perhaps a step back. But Caroline tried to rise again. Gathering her shattered confidence, she adjusted her microphone and said, "This is fiction. This is a television show," she said, as if trying to convince herself. And she continued, "This is emotional manipulation. It's even theater." Her voice wasn't loud this time, but it was filled with anger. It echoed through the room, but there was no applause, no support, not even the slightest eye contact she had been eagerly awaiting. Because everyone now understood that this was no longer a debate, but a showdown. The host straightened up slightly, took off his headphones and placed them on the table. He turned to Caroline and nodded slightly. "Caroline, you set this scene, but even you couldn't predict what would come of it." Caroline froze for a moment. Then she stood up. She gathered the cards on the table angrily and whispered into the microphone, "I will never be a part of this circus." The sound of her heels hitting the studio floor echoed like gunshots. No one stopped her. No one looked after her. Even her departure became part of the silence. And then, another voice rose from among the audience. This time, a middle-aged black woman sitting in the third row stood up. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was calm. She didn't ask for the microphone. There was no need. The silence in the room would carry every word she spoke. "I didn't come here to speak," she said, "but I feel compelled to say something." Everyone turned their heads to look at her. Jimmy lowered his eyes, ready to listen to her with respect. "My son served in Afghanistan. Then he came home in a coffin. He was in uniform, but they still called him the boy, just like they call you, Mr. Butler." The sighs rising from the room were a sign that tears could no longer be held back. The woman looked at Jimmy with loving eyes. Her voice trembled as tears streamed down her cheeks. "When you spoke, I felt my son rise again. His name was never heard, but today it was as if his voice echoed in my ears through your words." This time Jimmy did not get up, but he slowly raised his head and looked into the woman's eyes. He had connected her pain with his own past. He bowed his head silently. It was a thank you, both on her behalf and on behalf of thousands of others. And the woman said her final words, "America needs people like you, not just those who shout, but those who listen, not just those who see, but those who understand." These words echoed through the hall. If they were engraved on a tombstone, they would be just as heavy. The hall did not applaud this time, because everyone felt that after these words, silence was more powerful than applause. The cameras turned back to Jimmy. His eyes were moist, but his demeanor was still calm. It was clear that storms were raging inside him, but that storm was reflected outward only as a gentle breeze. The host took a deep breath and asked, choosing his words carefully, "Mr. Butler, millions of people are watching you right now. Surely you have something you want to say to them." Jimmy turned his eyes to the camera. This time, he was looking directly at America, and the first sentence he uttered pierced hearts like a knife. "Having to be wonderful in order to be seen. That can kill a person's soul." He paused for a few seconds. Then he added, "I never wanted to pity myself, but to be seen and to feel that they understood me. That was the greatest reward in life for me." The room fell silent again. This time, not only the words, but also the glances were speaking. Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket again. This time, he pulled out a folded drawing. When he held it up to the camera, the audience didn't immediately understand what they were looking at. But when he explained, their throats tightened once more. "Last year, I visited a children's hospital in Chicago. An 8-year-old girl drew this flag for me. On the left was the American flag, and on the right was a colorful flag she had made herself." Jimmy lifted the paper a little higher. The drawing was clearly visible on the large screen. "She told me, 'You two are fighting for us.' And then she smiled, because in her eyes, I was a superhero. But the real hero was that child, because she still believed with hope." Sniffles began to be heard in the hall. The host clutched his handkerchief, and a few audience members tried to wipe their glasses. Jimmy carefully folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "I fight every day on the field, but the real battle begins when the cameras stop rolling. And tonight, I was facing one of the toughest games of my life." And then something happened on the screen. The host listened to the sound coming through his earpiece and turned to the camera. His eyes were wide, and there was a mix of surprise and excitement on his face. "Mr. Butler, someone wants to see you," he said. "We have a live connection." The screen went dark. Then a colorful drawing appeared, and the face of that little girl, Aaliyah. She had wanted to connect from the hospital room to the studio. She was holding a red, white, and blue flag in her hand, and she was smiling. "Hello, Jimmy," she said. Jimmy's face softened with joy. The wall of ice he had just built with words seemed to melt away at the sound of her voice. His lips trembled. His eyes sparkled. He leaned slightly toward the screen and replied in a whisper, "I haven't forgotten you, Aaliyah." The little girl's eyes sparkled. She was sitting on her bed, holding the flag tightly. The cameraman slowly zoomed in. At that moment, everyone watching was not just seeing a child's face, but also a heart beating with hope. "You told me I was strong," said Aaliyah, "but tonight you are stronger. I'm crying, but it's tears of joy and happiness." Everyone in the studio felt their hearts stop at that moment. The host had lowered the microphone and was standing off to the side, with his head bowed. Some viewers were searching for tissues. Caroline Leavitt had already left, but the mark she left behind was no longer a wound. It was a transformation. Aaliyah continued speaking. "You told me to get back on my feet, and I'm telling you, Jimmy, the next time someone calls you a kid, I'll say, 'That's Jimmy Butler.'" Jimmy placed his hand over his heart. Tears began to roll down his cheeks, but these were not tears of weakness, but of honor. "You gave me strength," said Aaliyah, "and now I'm not afraid anymore." The screen slowly faded to black. When the connection ended, no one in the room spoke. Nothing had been as profound as that small voice. Jimmy sat up slightly and turned to the room, beginning to speak once more. I came here tonight as an athlete, that's true. Maybe some people know me that way. But who I am is not defined by the points I score. The greatest lesson life has taught me is this: the victories you win on the field are not as important as the respect you earn in people's hearts. My mother always told me, people may forget what you said, Jimmy, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Jimmy paused for a moment, because the eyes in the room were fixed on him. This was no longer a studio program. It had become a lesson in humanity. Tonight, here, we shared this memory born of an insult. But this is not just my story. It is the story of every person who has been belittled, ignored, or told, you can never do that. And now, I want to read something else to you. He reached into his jacket pocket again. This time, he pulled out a small envelope. There were a few words written on it in handwriting. Caroline Leavitt. The host opened his eyes. The audience looked at each other in shock. Jimmy slowly opened the envelope and took out the letter inside. His voice was deeper this time, calmer, and more forgiving. It was left under my door this morning. A note from Caroline. She wrote, I told you to sit down, child, but you showed me how a person should stand tall. I was wrong. I don't want forgiveness, but I hope my daughter will grow up inspired by your strength, and I hope that one day, I too will show the courage you have shown. A deep sigh echoed through the hall. Jimmy carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. Healing doesn't happen in silence, he said. Healing happens with courage, and sometimes courage can be hidden even in an apology note. The host took the microphone. His voice was hoarse. He cleared his throat. Mr. Butler, tonight you showed millions not just yourself, but a truth. This is a moment that will not be forgotten for a long time. Jimmy stood up. The studio fell silent once more. This time, no one clapped, because this time, the silence was respect. He bowed his head slowly, took a deep breath, and spoke for the last time. Sometimes, a man's greatest strength lies in his silence, and I stand not just for myself, but for everyone who has never been seen before. At that moment, one of the cameramen walked onto the stage. He extended his hand to Jimmy. Since the microphones were still on, his whisper was clearly heard. You reminded us that we are human. What happened after that night? The program went viral. People turned off their TVs and listened only to Jimmy's words. The most shared word on Twitter was one, watch. The next morning, a letter arrived from the National Civil Rights Museum. It read, tonight you didn't just speak for yourself, you spoke for millions. We want to permanently display your words in our new exhibition, The Flame of Honor. A week later, Caroline Leavitt returned to the studio, without a camera, without makeup. She had only a note in her hand, left for Jimmy to find, and on that note was written, you stood tall. I fell, but that fall taught me how to be human again. Thank you. Jimmy Butler never returned to that studio, but something remained there for every guest who came. An empty chair, no name on it, but everyone knows. That chair is where a basketball player made an assist to humanity.